The government's proposed anti-strike legislation has had its first debate in Parliament. The proposed bill would enable employers to force workers to break a strike to ensure that a minimum level of service is maintained. Sectors that could be affected include the health services, fire and rescue and transport. But the proposed law would also limit the right of teachers to strike. It follows a national education union ballot of its members, which closes on Friday and is expected to result in the biggest industrial action by teachers in many years. Primary and secondary teachers in Scotland are already on strike. Now, among those in favour of the new anti-strike laws was Tory MP Jonathan Gullis. He had this to say about teachers and the NEU.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I proudly put on the record my register of interest as a former teacher and a former trade union member and representative for the NASUWT. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am very worried about seeing teachers going on strike because it's the pupils that will suffer the most, particularly disadvantaged pupils from areas like Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torquay. And whilst I am a huge admirer of the incredible work teachers do, they are sadly being cajoled by barren bosses in unions like the Not Education Union, led by Bolshevik Balsen and Commie Courtney, with their Labour mates to force teachers out of the classroom and make sure that kids continue to suffer. What can we do to make sure pupils will not be victims any further?
What Gullis, too busy screeching about commies and Bolsheviks, seems to be missing is how grossly the Tories have degraded education in the last 12 years. A Guardian article just this week reported this. According to a Labour analysis of Department for Education statistics, of just under 270,000 teachers who qualified in England between 2011 and 2020, more than 81,000 have since left the profession, or 3 in 10 of the total. More recently, 13% of teachers in England who have qualified since the last general election in December 2019 quit in the subsequent 2 years, about 3,000 in total. So why have a third of teachers who qualified after 2010 left the profession? One answer is falling pay. This graph is from the Financial Times. It shows how teachers' pay has fallen dramatically in England since 2010, when the Tories came to power. Head teachers, that's the pink line, have seen their real terms pay fall by about 5%. Meanwhile, classroom teachers, that's the green line, have had to swallow a real terms cut of over 10%. Teachers in leadership positions, that's the blue line, have felt a 10% cut, as have all teachers averaged out. That's the grey line there. It's not just salaries that are driving teachers to strike action, though. Over the last 12 years, the amount of money allocated per pupil to state education has also fallen. This graph from the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows how the gap between the amount of money spent on state and independent school pupils has changed. During the Blair and Brown years, per pupil funding in the state sector grew at the same rate as per pupil in the private sector. And in 2010, the average per pupil spend was £8,000 in the state sector. But after the Tories took over, that all changed. Private per-head funding continued to grow, but state per-head funding fell. By 2020, state school pupils were only being funded to the tune of £7,000 per head. And the gap between state and private school spending has more than doubled. That drop in funding has created even harder working conditions for state school teachers. The newspaper spoke to a secondary teacher in Cambridgeshire who said this: "My payslip is contracted to 32 hours a week, but I work more than 45 hours. I'm a teacher who doesn't do work at home, but there are so many for whom that's not the case. It's really a problem of staff shortages, which is heavily linked to funding, although we do find it much more difficult to recruit because people aren't going for the jobs. I feel as a sort of minimum, we should have the time we need to do our jobs well. Everyone is just really stretched. The children's standard of education is lower than when I started 5 years ago because I don't have the time that I would like to teach them as I'd like to. The classes are massive, literally not enough chairs or tables in the classroom, which means I'm not able to give them the time and attention they need, and I'm not able to give my lesson planning the time it needs, and that is because I want to have a break when I get home. That seems fair enough to me. No teachers take going on strike lightly. Certainly I don't. For me, it will be a last course of action, but the situation we are in is not sustainable. And if you're going to look at the bigger picture, which is about where is education going, then a more drastic form of action is needed for things to change." That was Laura, a secondary school teacher who is presumably both a Bolshevik and a commie. That's if we take MP Gullis at his word.
This is part of a kind of broader McCarthyite attack on education systems. We've been seeing it in the higher education sector where I work, and we're also now seeing it in the schooling sector. And that kind of McCarthyist Red Scare attack always goes for education systems. It goes for schools. It goes for universities. Why? Because these are spaces that really heavily shape how we go on to interact with the world. They're one of the few places that we have in our society that are, supposed to be dedicated to developing critical faculties, to intellectually exploring, different ways of thinking. Now, it's not always able to do that because of the conditions that are forced onto it, but theoretically, it has the potential to do that. And so that's why the education system is always particularly the state education system, which is, obviously for more working class kids, is always in the crosshairs of conservative governments in particular. And most teachers that I've spoken to have said that, first of all, the ability to use school as a space to develop critical thinking skills has become really difficult because of these conditions, not only because the curriculum has gotten narrower and more rigid. Michael Gove, one of the first things he did as education secretary way back in 2010, I think it was with the coalition government rather than when they got the majority. One of the first things he did was, went for the history curriculum, went for the English curriculum, really tried to strangle the scope with which teachers could explore and be creative and use their flair with the curriculum. Teachers don't have time to do the kind of extra, both pastoral work, but also, creative way. Everyone has that teacher that really changed the way they think about things. And that involves having a level of time and space and resources to inject your own creativity into how you teach a particular subject. That kind of part of teaching has been completely strangled out. And that's quite an ideological part of austerity. And it's an ideological attack on what schooling should be for, that it shouldn't be this thing where we develop people's ability to critically analyze the world around them. And, this kind of really cheap attack, striking teachers commies and Bolsheviks, is really kind of part of that paranoia about what is going on in schools, particularly what's going on in state schools. And I'll just finish with saying that we have to remember that a disproportionate number of particularly conservative MPs have their children in private schools and themselves went to private schools. For them, having a completely bare bones, destroyed comprehensive education sector works in their favor because it widens the gap between state educated kids and privately educated kids. So it gives them more bang for their buck of what they're paying for when they go to when they send their kids to private school, which is a competitive edge over working class kids. They're trying to put down working class kids so that their kid will always look better no matter what. And so this is both an ideological, political attack, both in the sense of it's reducing the scope for teachers to engage with their kids, to not just, give their kids information, but actually develop critical faculties. And it's also a way of widening that gap between the class of people who can go to private school, who can send their kids to private school, and everyone else.
Watching that from Jonathan Gullis, it's just, you have to be so stupid to think that, or so shameless to say it if he knows he's lying, right? Because what you'll often hear from the Tories is they talk about industrial action as if there's this small cabal of very ideologically motivated people who are forcing good, honest, decent workers to go out on strike when actually they don't want to be. Now, what that ignores is you have a ballot, right? So there will be a negotiation for pay increases or over conditions, and then workers will be balloted. And by the way, because of Tory laws passed in the 2010s, the threshold for going on strike is now really, really high. You have to have 40% of all eligible employees voting yes. The turnout threshold is high, really, really difficult to get. People are still managing because they're pissed off, by the way. But they're not managing to get 40% of a workforce to vote in favor of strikes because they're all Bolsheviks or communists. No. This is an entire workforce of thousands of people who want to go on strike. Why? Because they've had pay cuts of 10% over 10 years and their workload is increasing. What rational person who gets a pay cut of 10% and gets their workload increased and also has less satisfaction from their work because they're seeing that the product they are creating, educated kids, is becoming harder because of funding cuts? What rational person wouldn't go on strike in those circumstances? And so to suggest that there's some sort of ideological revolutionary motive for people to not want 10% pay cuts and decreased conditions. I struggle to work out what's going on in that guy's head. Like, either he is so disingenuous and so shameless that he knows what he's saying is bullshit and he's saying it anyway, or he is just very, very dense. You don't need a complicated explanation. You don't need to look into the history of Kevin Courtney or Mary Boosted, the joint general secretaries of the NEU. And by the way, I don't really know the political histories of those two people, but it's not particularly relevant. If teachers vote to go on strike, the reason they will have voted to go on strike is because they are protesting the fact that they've been treated like shit for 12 years. I talk about this all the time on show. I have endless respect for teachers. I was a TA for a couple of years before I went into journalism. And my big takeaway from it, TAs and teaching assistant, they work really goddamn hard. That's why I didn't become a teacher. They work too hard for me, right? The hours are long and you have to be on it all the time because it's always you standing in front of 30 kids and you have to be on it all the time because this is why I was not a very good TA. Every now and again, I'd be like, come on, guys, come on, kids. There's two ways we could do this. You know, I could be really strict and make you do or we could just all talk reasonably to each other and look at this rap that this lesson that I designed for you. I got destroyed every time, right? You have to be on it all the time. You can't have any down moments. So these people should get paid really goddamn well because it is a really, really hard, tiring job. And, you know, Jonathan Gullis is trying to say, I'm a teacher. I know about this. I was a union rep. You're also an idiot. If you think that the reason they're going to go on strike is because they're commies and Bolsheviks, you're an idiot. So I don't care what your previous job was. Everything you say is now discounted of value.